My own interest in the subject of inequality began actually when I was growing up. I grew up in Gary, Indiana, which was an industrial town on the southern shores of Lake Michigan. It really traced the history of industrialization, and so therefore is very much related to UNIDO. It was founded in 1906 as the largest integrated steel mill in the world. It was a company town. In fact, it was so much of a company town that Gary was named after the chairman of the board of U.S. Steel. You can't be much more of a company town than that. But I didn't realize when I was growing up in the 50s that this was the golden age of capitalism. It was as good as it got, because in fact what I saw as I was growing up was a lot of inequality, a lot of poverty, a lot of racial discrimination, a very divided city where there was episodic unemployment, labor strife. And it was really that which motivated me to go into economics. I had thought when I went to the university I would study physics, and I did study physics for a number of years, but in the end it was the desire to try to understand these social forces that had led to that divide. It was a period in the United States when we were also having protests, racial, the civil rights movement, that induced me to go into economics. I wrote my thesis on the subject of inequality, which is the subject of this book and my next book, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. I still think it was published in Econometrica. It was called The Distribution of Income and Wealth Among Individuals. I still think it's the best article that's been written on the subject. So I hope many of you read it. But a couple of years ago, I wrote an article in Vanity Fair. And it got a lot larger readership than my article in Econometrica. So my advice to those of you who are young, who want to get a large readership, publish in Vanity Fair rather than Econometrica. The title of the article that I wrote in Vanity Fair was Of the 1%, For the 1%, and By the 1%. And it gave rise to the movement that you're referring to, that we are the 99%. I don't know if all of you know, it was an echo to a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave in the middle of the Civil War that every young American has to learn, the Gettysburg Address, where he was talking about why the United States was fighting the Civil War, in which so many people got killed. And what he said in this famous address was, so that government of the people, for the people, and by the people will not perish from this earth. So it was a very parochial view, as if we were the only country that had democracy, but we'll put that aside. But the real point of the article was that somehow this aspiration that was given in 1863, by the beginning of the 21st century, had been lost. And we had become a country where the government was a government of the 1%, for the 1%, and by the 1%. So this talk is basically how the United States got there, and how many other countries who are emulating the American model are getting in a similar position. It is a dramatic change in what has happened in economics in the last, I would say, third of a century. Again, when I was a graduate student, one of the things that we were trying to explain was something called Caldor stylized facts. We were trying to explain why it was that income distributions did not change, why there was such stability in the distribution of income. And just as we explained why distribution did not change, it started to change. And all the theories that we developed then, this is, you might say, a full employment program for economists. So just as we explained why they didn't change, they started to change, and now we have to explain why they've changed so much in the last third of a century. And that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. The subject of inequality has finally come to the fore in the United States. Not a surprise, because we've excelled in it. The United States always likes to do things better than other countries, and this is an area where we have done better than all other advanced countries. We have more inequality than anybody else. Some of the developing countries are really competing, like China now has almost as much as the United States. But there are differing circumstances that can explain developing countries, why it's not a surprise that they might have more inequality. So concomitantly with the increase in this inequality, it's become a political issue. And the good news is that both parties in the United States, both the Republican and Democrat Party, are talking about inequality. The Democratic Party about how to get it down, and the Republican Party about how to get it up. But that was not a political statement, let me make that clear. That was just a descriptive statement of American politics. It has become a subject of discussion very much it will be in the 2016 election. So there has been this enormous growth in inequality, and while most of what I'm going to be talking about today is about inequality in income, I want to emphasize that there are many dimensions to inequality, and we have to keep our focus on all of them. Inequalities of wealth are much greater than inequalities of income. Just to give you one statistic that sort of encapsulates, a couple of statistics that encapsulates the growth of inequality in wealth, every year in Davos, which is, not that far from here, where all the muckety-mucks get together every January, Oxford comes out with a report, and their report describes that a bus with about, when first year they came out, with about 2013, a bus with about 80 seats, most of the people on that bus were at Davos, has as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the world. Each year that bus gets smaller. So now that bus of some 80 is down to a bus of about 65, 69 people. But the United States does even better. There are 8 Americans from 2 families who inherited their wealth. So they didn't get their wealth by working, let's make it clear. From 2 families that have as much wealth as the bottom 44% of Americans, which is testimony both about how much wealth there is at the top, but also how little wealth there is at the bottom. Those 2 families, just to put names, faces on these, are the Waltons, the Walmart, famous for its gender discrimination, good labor relations. It excels in corruption in Mexico and elsewhere. But it's how the market economy works. They became very wealthy. And the other one is the Koch brothers. So that's the inequality in wealth. There are other dimensions. I can't go through all of them. Another one is inequality in health. In the United States, that's particularly important because we are the only advanced country that does not recognize access to health as a basic human right. And Obama's been fought very hard to get a kind of basic coverage, but basically failed. A report came out just a couple weeks ago from Angus Deaton, who is getting the Nobel Prize in a couple weeks in economics and case. And the results of this were really quite striking. Everybody always had known that the United States spent more money than other advanced countries, both absolutely and as a percentage of GDP. We spent about 17% of our income on health. And life expectancy in the United States is at the bottom of the advanced countries. And so, you know, compared to, say, France, that spends around 11%, Australia spends about 8%, our life expectancy is 3, 4, 5 years lower than these other countries. But Americans always took comfort in saying, oh yes, but we are a diverse country, and because of that diversity, all these other people who don't know how to live well, healthily, that's why we have such bad outcomes. Well, what Deaton and Case did is they looked at life expectancy and health among white Americans. And the striking thing is that life expectancy among white Americans has been declining, when in the rest of the world it's been increasing. And declining very dramatically, especially among those Americans who who've just graduated from high school, haven't gone to college. The decline in life expectancy is the kind of decline that we've seen only once before, and that was in recent years, and that was in Russia after the fall of the Berlin Wall. When I was chief economist of the World Bank in the late 90s, and one of the striking things is that the market was supposed to bring higher incomes, faster growth, but the data was coming in and says that income in Russia was declining by about 1/3. But we weren't sure about the numbers. But then we started getting demographic numbers. Life expectancy was going down. The disparity between life expectancy in Russia and that in the other countries was increasing by 2-3 years. And that was sort of corroborating evidence that things weren't going very well. The same thing is true, has been going on in the United States. So to me, it was not a surprise. Numbers I'll give in a few minutes. Income of Americans adjusted for inflation who have not graduated from college, who have just graduated from high school, is down by about 20% in the last couple of decades. And so it's not a surprise that in a country where you're told every generation is going to be better off than the next, and you see your income going down, that there'll be a lot of stress. And so what's also striking is the major source of the shortened lifespan and the increased illness in the United States corresponds to that what was going on in Russia. It's alcoholism, drugs, and suicides. So there's clearly a social illness going on in the United States that corresponds to the increase in inequality. As I said, there are many other dimensions to this increase in inequality. And one other dimension, won't have time to talk about, but there is an essay in my book, The Great Divide, on this, is inequality in access to justice. So I jokingly say every American, in the beginning of every day, part of the inculcation of patriotism is we say we pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and at the end there says there's a little phrase, with justice for all. And now they're going to change that to with justice for all who can afford it. No, they're not. They haven't yet done this, but this is really what the... There are also many dimensions in terms of, inequality. What we mean by that is a probability distribution. It's a whole distribution. You can't summarize anything as complicated as a distribution in a single number. And that's why we talk about inequality at the top. There's more money going to the top. There's more poverty at the bottom. And there's an evisceration of the middle. America was proud to be the first middle-class society. We are now about the first country who was a middle-class society that's ceasing to be a middle-class society. So what I want to do now is just to go very quickly through some graphs to give you a picture of what's going on. This is the top 1% of the United States. And what this shows is that inequality reached a very high level in the period right in the 20s, the period right before the Great Depression, and then reached another peak in the period right before the Great Recession. And these numbers are striking. The top 1% gets close to 25% of all the income. And that's more than doubled, about 2.5 times what it was in that golden age of capitalism that I grew up in, when inequality was at a relatively low. If you look more closely, say at the top 1/10 of 1%, the share of the top 1/10 of 1% is increased almost fourfold. So the increase in inequality has been worse as you go up the scale. Similarly, if you go down the scale, most of that, if you look at what's happened between the top 1% and 10%, what you see is you don't see this pattern. That hasn't changed. So most of the change in inequality at the top has been at the very top. Now, an idea that has been widely discussed is an idea called trickle-down economics. That don't worry about the rich getting richer because everybody benefits. Money trickles down. There's some discussion of what that, what that metaphor means. But in any case, I wish trickle-down economics were true, because we've thrown so much money at the top that if it were true, we'd all be doing very well. But the next chart shows you that, in fact, it isn't true. That, in fact, median income, median is half above, half below, adjusted for inflation, now in the United States is lower than it was 25 years ago. But median for the income as a whole is an average of different demographic groups. And if we start looking at breaking it down in demographic groups, you see many, not surprisingly, some demographic groups are much worse than others. One demographic group that I feel some affinity for is males. And the next chart shows what's happened to median income of a full-time male worker. And what you see there is the median income of a full-time male worker today in the United States is lower than it was 40 years ago. So if you want to understand American politics and some of the weird things on the right, those people who are supporting Trump and Carson, just look at this chart and you'll have a feeling for why there are a lot of angry young American males. At the bottom, things are worse, even worse. The wages at the bottom, minimum wage, in the United States, adjusted for inflation, is lower than it was 60 years ago. So those at the bottom haven't gotten a pay raise in more than a half a century. So my view is very strongly that an economy, a market economy, that does not serve most individuals in our society, an American economy has not been doing that for a quarter century, in some respects a half century, is a failed market economy. Now, I'm not going to be able here to tell you all the reasons for this failure, but I think it is, just an important warning. Some people have tried to emulate that, try to get our trade agreements, try to get other provisions, and just a little warning, this is not all rosy. But the most invidious aspect of American inequality is inequality of opportunity. When we talk about inequality of income, you talk to somebody like Paul Ryan, who is the head of the Speaker of the House, was the vice presidential candidate in the Republican Party. He'll say very explicitly, I don't care about inequality of income, inequality of outcome. What I care about is opportunity. And the unfortunate thing is he didn't look at the data. America is at the bottom in inequality of opportunity as well. So, you know, this is very contrary to Americans' self-perception. We believe that we are a land of opportunity. Most other people think of America as a land of opportunity. What social scientists, what economists mean by opportunity is, what are the life prospects? And the life prospects of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in virtually any of the other advanced countries. So I tell my students there's really one important decision that you have to make, choice that you make in your life. And that's choosing the right parents. And if you don't do that right, the game is over. Now this relationship, the fact that inequality of opportunity is so bad is not a surprise, because there is in fact a systematic relationship between inequality of income and inequality of opportunity that's been very well studied. And this is a map showing on the horizontal axis the equality of opportunity, it's the intergenerational earnings mobility, and on the vertical axis the Gini coefficient, which is the standard measure of inequality. And this is OECD data, so there are a couple of countries that are not advanced countries there, and you should not pay much attention. Chile has a very high level of inequality, and it's, you can see the flag up there on the top. But what you see is up in the very high level of inequality and very low level of opportunity are the United States, Great Britain, and Italy. And Great Britain has been aspiring to doing quite good job of trying to increase its inequality by following the American model. And it's succeeded in some ways, even doing better than the United States. At the other extreme, down there at a very low level of inequality and a high level of equality of opportunity are the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Finland, and Norway. Let me talk just very quickly about global inequality. Almost all of the OECD countries have had an increase in inequality over the last 30 years. That's obviously and there's obviously a source of concern. Some of the developing countries, particularly in Latin America, have succeeded in reducing inequality, and some of them have done it significantly. Brazil has succeeded in a bipartisan way. Center-right government of Cardoso and the center-left government of Lula both introduced policies that led to a reduction, significant reduction in inequality over the last 20 years. And it's really quite significant in the sense that often it's inequality takes a long time to manifest, changes in inequality take a long time, and they succeeded. Just as a little bit of an anecdote, you were mentioning the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I had tried to make sure that one of the SDGs was on inequality. One of the interesting things about the SDGs is they apply not only to developing countries, but to developed countries. And when I was pushing for a Sustainable Development Goals on inequality, I was worried that even though Obama has said that he was going to make inequality the main focus of his last 3 years in office, it is embarrassing for the United States to be up there at the top. And so I was afraid that they would oppose it. And I was also afraid that our partner in crime, Great Britain, would also oppose it. And not surprisingly, they both did. And Cameron was head of a committee that worked for the UN to do a draft, and it wasn't there. They dropped inequality. But we managed to continue to fight, and it shows you, it's really quite interesting. It is now the sustainable goal number 10, and we overcame the opposition of both the United States and the UK. So things do happen. Of course, that doesn't mean it's going to change, but at least there is a focus on this issue. This just goes very, very quickly over a large number of countries' inequality. And if you have good eyesight, you can see Austria is down there with a relatively low level of inequality near Finland, Netherlands, and Sweden. It's one of the better countries. So you can feel good about yourself for now. Most of the countries in the OECD are, however, having an increase in inequality. I want to go quickly to another interesting aspect about global inequality. Some people say, well, yes, there's been an increase in inequality in most countries around the world. But what about inequality looking at the world as a whole? If you took a very cosmopolitan view, forget about all boundaries. What's been happening to inequality overall? And there's some both good news and the bad news. The good news is that China and India have been growing very rapidly, and the middle class in these economies are doing relatively well. So what this chart does is look at the global income distribution, just ranks all the people in the world as if it was one big family, and from bottom to the top, and asks what's been happening in each of those part of the income distribution. Is from work of Branko Milanovic, who worked with me at the World Bank. And what you see is two dramatic things. The first is, you see among the highest rates of growth are those at the very, very top. That's the 1% in the advanced countries, and the billionaires in India and the billionaires in China. So those are doing very well. The other group that's doing very well are the middle classes in India and China. They're growing from a low base, but they're growing very rapidly. There are two groups that are doing really badly. Up at the 80th percentile are the middle class in the United States and Europe. And they're basically seeing stagnant income. That was the number I showed you before. And the other group, of course, are the poorest people in the poorest country. They also aren't doing very well. So what I want to turn now is from this just very broad description of what's happening in the world to changes in our understandings of inequality. How do we interpret what's been going on? And I've hinted at a couple of these things, but I'll go through them fairly quickly. The first is that trickle-down economics doesn't work. In fact, there was never a good theory or empirical evidence in support of it. But in spite of the fact that there was such weak evidence in support of it, in practice, governments continued to follow it. And that's even true in a democratic government in the United States. So for instance, when the crisis occurred in the United States in 2008, the Obama administration and the Fed both focused on the top, on saving the banks, not on saving ordinary Americans. An example, if you remember you won't remember because you're too young, but if you read it from a textbook, back in 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, It was September 15th, and the election was in November of that year. And so Obama was the candidate, and right after Lehman Brothers collapsed, Obama had a conference call with the economic advisors and a number of people about how to respond to this economic crisis. And Bush had proposed giving $700 billion to the banks. And for those of you who don't know what that means, $700 billion is a lot of money. Dollars is now, not worth quite as much as a euro, but still, think about it as it's a lot of money. So we had this conference call with a lot of bankers on it, and the first question is, why did you limit? Why only $700 billion? And I remember the answer was, well, $1 trillion is a little too, might scare people. But don't worry, if you need more, we have it. We'll write a check. So don't worry, this is just the first beginning of the and then I said, well, I raised the question, the crisis had begun as a housing crisis, a subprime housing crisis. And I said, don't you think you ought to be thinking about some of the ordinary Americans who are being thrown out of their homes? In the end, millions of Americans were thrown out of homes, including some people who didn't owe any money. That was part of the problem of the access to justice. And the bankers' reaction is, try to shush me up. What is this guy doing on this phone call when we're talking about serious things about saving the banks, and you're talking about ordinary Americans? So in the end, after a lot of fight, we got out of the $700 billion, we got about $2 billion for ordinary Americans. It was trickle-down economics. The Fed, same thing. Their basic strategy was trickle-down economics. QE was to get the stock market price up, and the hope with the stock market price high enough, people would spend. And they spent a little bit, but it was not a very strong recovery. In the first 3 years of the recovery, 91% of all the increase in the income in that recovery went to the top 1%. So most Americans are saying, whose recovery? I was out at Jackson Hole in August with, which is where the central bankers from all over the world get together. And but this time, I was with a group of civil society protesters. Even though we have this thing called the First Amendment, the right to protest and all that, we weren't allowed to do it, even though it was a national park that they were getting together. So we had our own meeting in the same place that they were having their meeting, and they wore T-shirts. We weren't allowed to have placards, but we had T-shirts that gave all the data that that African Americans had an average unemployment rate that was twice that of the rest of Americans. Youth unemployment was twice that. So the youth unemployment of African Americans is still 20%, almost as bad as things in Europe. That was a joke. It's not that bad. But we were protesting the idea that there was a recovery and they could start raising the interest rates. Anyway, the fact is that both the Fed and Obama relied on trickle-down economics, and it didn't work. We really have had a very anemic recovery. The second idea is an idea that many of you may know, Kuznets' law. Kuznets was a great economist in the middle of the 20th century, and he was writing in 1950, and he saw this part of the chart that I said in the beginning. He saw that inequality going down when he said, well, in the first stage of development, inequality goes up, and then in the second stage it goes down. He couldn't see what was going to happen, that it was going to start going up again. And there was a good theory about why it should go down in the second stage of development. In the first stage, parts of the economy that are more, some parts of society are better able to take advantage of the new opportunities and they pull out, and then the others pull in. But now we know that Kuznets was wrong, that as economies develop, you could get more inequality. So one of the big issues is what was unusual about the 1950s, 60s, this period, the golden age of capitalism that I talked about. Was it an aberration, the result of the unusual social cohesion brought on by World War II, with the economy now returning to the natural state of capitalism? And that's the view, by the way, that Piketty has, that the natural state of capitalism has a high degree of inequality, and that was just an aberration. I'm going to argue, very briefly, because I've been told I only have 5 minutes, that the increase in inequality after 1980 was a result of change in policies. It's not the natural state of capitalism, but it was an aberration of capitalism. The fact that I showed earlier that there are large differences in outcomes and opportunities among advanced countries suggests that it is not the laws of economics, but its policies. It's not the inexorable economic forces that are at play. The laws of demand and supply are operating on the same on both sides of the Atlantic. So it's not like there are different laws of economics. And that's why I say inequality is a choice. Obviously the poor haven't made the choice, it's the political system. It's a result of how we structure the economy through our tax and expenditure policies, through our legal framework, our institutions, even the conduct of monetary policies. All of these affect market power, bargaining power, different groups, even access to jobs and the ability to participate in the labor market. And they result in the different distributions of income and wealth, both before taxes and transfers and after taxes and transfers. So this is my most recent book that just came out a couple weeks ago, called Rewriting the Rules of the American Economy. So what we've done is to say that really what's happened is that about a third of a century ago, coincidentally with Reagan becoming president, we began in the United States and many other countries in a similar way, an experiment, a grand experiment that said the following: let's lower the taxes at the top, let's free up the economy, liberalize, deregulate, and we'll have stronger incentives and more opportunity, and the economy will grow. Yes, there will be more inequality, but everybody, the economy is going to grow faster, and the result of that is that everybody will get a larger slice of a pie. Well, they were right about one thing: it would lead to more inequality, even more than they aspired to. But the rate of growth of the economy actually slowed down. And now that we've had a third of a century of this experiment, it's really time, we've been arguing, it's really time to reassess these policies and begin rewriting the rules again. So what we've done in this book is to try to delineate what were the rules that got rewritten that led to this inequality, and then how to rewrite them, not to go back to where we were a third of a century ago, but to rewrite them now for the 21st century in a way that will lead to more equality, and we would argue a faster rate of growth of the economy. And you'll see many of these ideas now being picked up by the the progressive candidates for the President of the United States. So one example of this is that some of the ways that we rewrote the rules led to more short-termism. The focus on the quarterly returns. You can't invest in people if you're focused on the next quarterly return. You can't invest in the economy. And so the question is, what were the rules that led to this kind of short-termism? And how does it lead both to less productive economy and a more unequal economy? The final that I'm going to be able to talk about, change in our understanding of inequality, is the repeal of this idea that sometimes called Okem's Law. Arthur Okem was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Johnson. And the idea was, economists love trade-offs, and the idea was, yes, you could have more equality, but only by sacrificing on economic growth. And the main theme of my previous book, called The Price of Inequality, was that that was wrong. That we pay actually a high price for inequality. That we could have higher economic growth, better economic performance, and more equality. I don't have time to go through the argument for why that's the case, but let me just say that you might expect that from a progressive, you might say a provocative economist, but it's no longer controversial. That even the IMF, and I don't know if any of you know the International Monetary Fund, which is not a left-wing organization, even the IMF has said that more equality is good for economic growth. Not only have they said it, they've gone around the world preaching this. So the implication of that is that we can afford to have more equality. There's one thing, final thing I want to say very briefly, because inequality is the result of our policies. It is shaped by politics, but economic inequality, especially in democracies where money talks, gets translated into political inequality. And then that political inequality leads to more economic inequality, and there's a vicious circle. And that's the problem the United States is engaged in right now. The last election in the United States, 2012, each of the candidates spent over $1 billion. The next election is expected to be multiple, cost of multiple of that. So the broader consequences, it undermines democracy. Inequality undermines democracy, divides societies, especially when the inequalities are on racial and ethnic lines, and you can see the consequences in Ferguson and Baltimore. It's resulted in the basic necessities of a middle-class society being increasingly out of reach of large proportions of the population. Let me just spend a moment for those of you who are economists here, and that talking about the analytic issue of how do we understand the growth of inequality. And I've given one interpretation, which is focusing on the changes of the rules of the market economy in ways that weaken the position of labor, increased monopoly power, and so forth. And Piketty has another interpretation, which is focusing on capital accumulation. And there are a lot of technical issues for those of you who having to do with whether he's focused on this idea the rate of return on capital is greater than the rate of growth, but the return on capital has to be endogenous. One has to create models that have macro and micro consistency. And when you look at those, it's very hard to get the kinds of results that he's talked about. What is really going on is depicted most forcefully by this graph here. I hope you can, yeah, you can see it clearly there, which is that historically, productivity and compensation have increased in tandem, but then beginning in the mid-70s, productivity continued to increase, slightly lower pace, but not much lower, but compensation stagnated. So this is not a story of capital accumulation. This is a story of something else happening to change the relationship between compensation and productivity. And that's what this theory is trying to get at. In fact, if you look at savings behavior and look at the data on savings, you can only explain about 1/2 to 3/4 of the growth in wealth-income ratio by national savings. So what is going on? And it's not savings in the usual sense. The increase in wealth in the United States and most other countries has to do not with savings, but with capital gains, with rents, with land rents, exploitation rents, monopoly power, political power, intellectual property rents. And the basic notion here is that wealth can go up even if productive capital in the economy is going down. And that's been happening in many countries around the world. In the United States, for instance, wealth relative to income, wealth has been going up, but capital has been going down. We haven't been savings, and part of the reason is our dysfunctional financial market and some of the rewriting of the rules that I talked about before. So let me just conclude. Addressing inequality is going to be, is part of the problem of why we have a weak global economy. Incremental changes will not suffice. Many of the candidates in governments in Europe and America have recognized inequality as a problem, but have talked about, well, we have to get better education or a little. Those kinds of incremental changes, while important, are not going to suffice. There has to be a comprehensive agenda which will significantly reduce inequality, increase equality of opportunity. So that's why we wrote this book, to say that it's not just going to be one thing or a little changes. It has to be more fundamental changes in the way the market, our market economy works. There's some urgency to making these decisions, because the decisions that we make today will affect inequality decades from now. The real question is not the economics. I think we know how to reduce inequality, not to eliminate it. No, that's not the issue. We will always have some inequality, but we don't have to have the extremes of inequality that have marked the United States and which are marking many other countries. It is the politics, and that is really where in a sense, a lot of the fight is going to be over. Can we change our politics in ways that will allow us to rewrite the rules of the economics in order to achieve a better performing economy and an economy with more equality? Thank you.